Thank you, Danielle, for getting this started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. We're so honored to have Dr. Carson here. She's an incredible professor, researcher, author, and she's had many wonderful classes at the Harvard Extension School. And we're really honored to work with her through our society, which is turning into a club, and also through HESA. HESA really did the heavy lifting on this event and made this event possible. We're very honored. Thank you for being here. And just wanted to do a very quick introduction of Dr. Carson. It's definitely not going to do justice because she's just outstanding, but Dr. Carson is dedicated to researching the interface between creativity, psychopathology, and resilience, exploring how creative activities benefit mental well-being. She also investigates the lives of highly creative individuals who face mental illness. She also focuses on brain health and optimizing brain fitness. And she teaches courses like creativity, psychopathology, resilience, habits and habit change, and science of brain health, offering students insights into human nature and flourishing within our complex world. We are so honored to have you. I'm going to hand over the floor to you. Welcome.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Kimia, and thank you to your club and also to HESA for providing this opportunity for me to talk to, once again, to talk to our extension school students. And I know that many of you already know this, but I actually started out my career in psychology as an extension school student, and I was in the ALM program. It was really interesting. I've been out of school for 28 years. But I read everything I could about pop psychology, and I listened to all kinds of psychological tapes and everything. It was just a subject that I couldn't get enough of. And so once my children were old enough to be in school all day long, I signed up to take a course. And the very first course I took was at the Harvard Extension School, and it was abnormal psychology. And at that time, it was taught by Dr. Charles Ducey. And I can tell you that it changed my life. It really changed my life. And so years later, decades later, after earning my doctorate in my 50s, so it's not too late, gang, and that led to publishing articles in scientific national and international journals, into traveling the world to give talks about my research, and to writing 2 books that ended up being critically acclaimed. But my biggest honor was that I had the privilege of being asked to teach the very same life-changing course at the Harvard Extension School in the very same lecture hall where I had first had that awe-inspiring experience. And I still get excited when I think, because I'm still teaching that course. We call it psychopathology now. We changed the name of it. And I know some of you have taken it, but I still get excited about the possibility that some student in the course is experiencing what I experienced decades ago, and that their world too will open up in ways they never imagined. Knowledge will do that to you. And it's one of the reasons that I love teaching, and I find that I always learn more from my students than I feel like I'm giving to them. But the main message I want to say here is you're never too old, and it's never too late to pursue your dreams. And the Extension School, which I know from personal experience, is a place where those dreams can begin to form and to flourish. And as an extension school student, you're in the right place. So thank you again for giving me the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about one of my courses today. Now, you would think after that, after saying that, I'd be talking about psychopathology, but that isn't actually what I want to talk about tonight. What I want to talk about is some excerpts from my creativity course, which is called Creativity, Eccentrics, Geniuses, and Madmen, or Psych E 1704. So I will share my screen, and I'll make sure that we have plenty of time afterwards for discussion and questions. Okay, so everybody see the slides okay? Good, thank you. All right, so the first thing that I want to do is just tell you a little bit about what we're going to go over tonight. I want to talk about why studying creativity is important, because believe me, when I first started studying it as a doctoral student in the Harvard Department of Psychology, everybody told me, oh, it's too touchy-feely. It's not a scientific topic. But as of today, we have researchers all over the world who are studying the neuroscience of creativity, and people are realizing how really important our human creativity is to us. So we'll look a little bit at that. I want to talk about what creativity is exactly. We'll talk about big C and little c creativity and the creative process. And I'll talk about a couple of things that we cover in the creativity course. So the first thing is, why is it important to study creativity? And those of you who've had other courses with me have probably heard a little bit of this answer already. The big reason is that creativity is our survival mechanism as a species. If you think about it from evolutionary terms, we weren't strong enough to fight off predators or fast enough to outrun them. The way that we survived as a species was through our human ingenuity, our creativity, that allowed us to build tools, to build weapons, to build shelters, to keep us safe in what is often still a rather hostile environment. Now, the man you see here, many of you probably recognize, is David Goggins, who I consider to be one of the most, if not the most, fit human being on planet Earth right now. But even he would be no match for these predators without some sort of creative device to assist him. And it's not just these giant predators or our other human predators, but microscopic predators that we also need our human creativity to fight. And it's continuing right now with the coronavirus, with cancers. We're using our human creativity to find cures, to find preventions for these diseases. Another aspect of why we want to study creativity is it's our long distance communication mechanism. Through types of creativity, including art and music and poetry and literature, we can communicate with each other across centuries, across continents, and across ideologies to share something of the human experience. An example that I often give is when my son was in high school, he played football and he had a football friend, a big hulking 17-year-old kid that carried around this dog-eared poem by Emily Dickinson in his pocket. And he carried it with him all the time. Now, I'm not exactly sure what that little woman from several centuries ago had to say to this big, burly 17-year-old kid. But what I do know is that we all have our equivalent of the Emily Dickinson poem, that there's something, maybe more than one thing, that speaks to us, that calls to us, that inspires us, perhaps a work of art, perhaps a piece of music, perhaps a poem, perhaps a novel, that helps us to understand ourselves and to situate ourselves in a world where we might have previously felt uncomfortable. So, communication mechanism across time and space. Now we know that the creative work of other people has not only inspired us, and given us joy and enrichment through music, through art, through literature, but it's also advances in transportation and technology and in medicine that have made our lives more comfortable and given us longer and more productive and more satisfaction in our lives. But it's not just the work of other people. Our own creative activity actually improves our mental and physical health. And there's a growing body of research that discusses this. And in fact, on Wednesday in our Lifestyle Medicine for Brain Health and Performance class, I'm going to be talking about how creativity is important for brain health. But I'll give you just a few reasons here. We know that creativity and creative activity can help us manage stress and anxiety. You may be familiar with the James Pennebaker studies that found that expressive writing, that is forming a story out of potentially stressful events, and can reduce illness, help you manage stress and anxiety, lead to fewer doctor's visits. Creativity can also lift depression and help as a treatment for depression. We see all the many creative therapies, art therapy, writing therapy, music therapy, dance therapy. And these have, in conjunction with other types of depressive therapies, help people to get through the dark periods of their lives. Creativity and creative activity can also increase our positive emotions. And one of my favorite studies in this vein is one that was done by Tamlin Connor and Colin DeYoung and Paul Sylvia. They looked at, in 2016, 658 young adults and had them use what's called a diary technique for this particular study. So these young adults filled out diaries for 113 days, and they filled out measures of positive and negative emotions, flourishing, feelings of well-being, and they also logged their creative activities. And the study found that not only did these individuals feel more positive emotions on the day that they did their creative activities, but the following day as well, and led to increased sense of flourishing. So we know that it can increase positive emotions, and we know that some of the mechanisms perhaps are meaning making, being able to get into a state of flow, and increasing approach systems in the brain rather than avoidance systems. Creative activity can also improve immune functioning and physical health. And one of the earliest studies, although there are plenty of studies that have looked at this now, was done by Lowe et al. In 2003. And they looked at poetry writing and secretory immunoglobulin, which is a marker for immune system functioning. And what they found was that compared to a control group that was doing another kind of writing, those who were writing poetry had better immune functioning after only one session of writing poetry. So we see there are many ways that creative activity can promote well-being and health. But are there even other reasons? And I'd like to share with you my own reason initially for wanting to study creativity. And that is looking at this list of people that we would certainly consider to be highly creative, but it's also a list of individuals that we know suffered from what I dub inner demons or mental illness issues. Some of them eventually took their own lives. Some of them were hospitalized, but all of them had periods of time where they were unable to function due to these inner demons. And you might say, oh, well, you're just pulling out some examples from history of people who were creative and actually did have mental illness. But there's an empirical research literature to go along with this. And this is this is a graph that I made for another publication showing the percentage of creative individuals with mood disorder compared to population norms. Now we know in the general population, about 20% of us over our lifetime will suffer from a mood disorder. And that includes bipolar disorder, major depressive disorder, and dysthymia, which is now called persistent depressive disorder. But compared to those norms, look at the norms in these other studies of highly creative individuals. All of them suffered from clearly much greater rates of mood disorder than the general population. The same thing we see with what's called psychosis proneness. So psychosis proneness is on the schizophrenia spectrum. People with psychosis proneness may be normal functioning individuals, but they have at least some of the genetic propensities of people with schizophrenia. And again, across a number of studies, we see that individuals who are in creative professions, who have creative achievements, have higher rates of psychosis proneness than those in the population. So the only group that didn't have higher rates was mathematicians. And I would submit to you that these are what we call bench mathematicians. These are mathematicians doing daily mathematical work. But when you get to the realm of theoretical mathematicians, people like John Forbes Nash, then we're going to see, again, more of this psychosis proneness. And I do think there are some reasons for this. I'm not sure if I'll get a chance to talk about that tonight, but I do think there are some reasons. And the last thing I want to look at is alcoholism, because this is another area where we tend to see highly creative people have greater rates of alcoholism. The rate for the general population is around 8% in the United States, but we see that all of these different studies, the findings for highly creative people were at least twice what we see in the general population. So another reason for us to study creativity is to try to understand this relationship between creativity and madness. And there certainly are people who believe that this relationship doesn't exist. But amongst highly creative individuals, I think the preponderance of the research falls on the side of having somewhat greater risk for these mental disorders, in particular mood disorders, psychosis proneness, and alcohol and drug addiction problems. Now, by the way, I just want to say that if you decide to enhance your creativity by anything that you hear about tonight, it's not going to increase your risk for mental illness, okay? So the final reason that I wanted to study creativity was to discover what factors lead to creative achievement in the hopes that we can use that information to enhance individual creativity of others, so that they can bring their blessings to society. So what exactly is creativity? What are we talking about when we talk about creativity? And I'm going to give you the scientific definition now, but I do want you to be aware of all the beautiful literary definitions of creativity that are out there. And there's some that are like, creativity is the attempt to forge order out of chaos. And I believe that that is actually what people who are being creative are doing. They're taking information that isn't fully formed, and they're bringing some order to it and then bringing that order to us. But as far as scientific definitions of creativity, what we see are that most researchers are in agreement that we need to have two factors involved. The first one is originality or novelty. Well, we would expect that. And the second one is usefulness or adaptiveness. And we might not be expecting that in our definition of creativity. But when we put the two together, our definition comes out to be this. Creativity is an ability to combine diverse elements or bits of information. And when I talk about these bits of information, they can be coming in from the environment. They can be already situated in your memory of skills, experiences, actual memories, etc., to form novel or original ideas or products that are in some way adaptive. And it doesn't have to be adaptive to the entire human race. It can be adaptive to some portion of that human race. So people, I do these creativity workshops all the time, and people will come to me and they'll say things like, I'm not creative at all. I can't even draw a stick figure. And what I have to say to them is they are conflating creativity with talent. They're two different things. Talent is skill or aptitude in a specific domain of endeavor, often associated with creative work, but it's usually identifiable pretty early in life. Now, our creative luminaries, the shakers and movers in creativity, probably have both creativity and talent. But you don't have to have talent to be creative. And you don't have to have talent to use your creativity for immense productivity. And one example that I would suggest to you is Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs was a highly creative individual, and he did his creativity in the field of technology, but he didn't have technological talent. His partner, Steve Wozniak, was the talented one as far as the technical side goes. But that didn't stop Steve Jobs from being immensely creative in that field. So you don't need talent, and creativity and talent are two different things. The next topic I wanted to look at was big C and little c creativity. So you've probably heard about this difference before. Little c creativity is our everyday type of creativity. And believe me, we're all using little c creativity all the time. For example, whenever you have a conversation with another person, you are employing creativity. That is a creative act. And how can I say that? Well, if you think about what you're doing when you're having a conversation with somebody else, you're taking bits of information, those are words, and you're combining them and recombining them in a novel and original way, unless you talk from a script all the time, that is, and it's adaptive because you're imparting information to another person. So every time you have a conversation, you are committing a creative act. Planning for a vacation is a creative act. Think of all the possibilities of places you could go, how you could get there, and what you could do once you're there. So planning a trip, planning a vacation is definitely an act of creativity. comforting a child whose feelings have been hurt. Maybe they didn't make the travel team. Maybe a friend said something hurtful to them. How do you comfort them? Finding a way to do that is an act of creativity, as is planting a garden. Gardens are wonderful creative acts. Or putting a meal together, combining different ingredients in a recipe, and then combining different dishes to make a full meal that's both palatable, beautiful, and appetizing. And then putting a room together, arranging your furniture so that it works for you, another creative act. So these are just some examples of little c creativity. Now let's compare that to big C creativity. And what we mean by big C creativity is domain-changing, earth-shaking, creative accomplishments that change the field in which they occurred for the future. We're talking about things like Newton's Principia, or Einstein's theory of relativity, or Shakespeare's plays, or Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, or Da Vinci's Mona Lisa. All of these things are big C creative acts. And there's many, many more of them. So one of the questions that we ask in the field of creativity research is big C quantitatively different from little c? That is it the same type of act? Is it the same process, only on a larger scale? Or is there something qualitatively different about big C creativity? Does it include all of the things we see in little c creativity, plus an extra spark of something? And so that's a field of inquiry, and we definitely look into it in the creativity course that I teach. Now, the final foundational thing for creativity that I want to talk about is the creative process. And I've been studying highly creative people for decades, and I've probably interviewed very close to 1,000 highly creative people by now. And what's really interesting to me is they all, when I ask them about their creative process, tell me more or less the same steps or stages that were originally laid out by Graham Wallace in his 1926 book, The Art of Thought. Now, most of the people I interview have never heard of Graham Wallace, and they've never heard of his stages of creativity, yet they still outline something very similar to this. So let me talk about these stages of creativity, and I feel like I can talk about them with a lot of confidence, that these are the steps in the creative process. And the first one is preparation. So remember, we talked about the fact that you combine bits of information or recombine them in novel and original ways to come up with creative ideas. Where do those bits of information come from? They come from knowledge. And in a way, you've been preparing for the creative process all your life, ever since you started learning things, whether it was in school or out of school. So what we want is a broad base of knowledge across multiple domains and multiple fields, so that you can pick bits of information from something far afield and combine it in a domain that you already know to come up with an original idea. So no type of knowledge is off limits. Learn everything you can. And I know you're learners because you're here tonight. The second part of that preparation process is learning specific skills and knowledge in a particular domain in which you might want to do creative work. So if you want to work in the field of music, you might learn musical notation, you might learn how to play an instrument, etc. Then the third aspect of preparation is creative idea finding a creative problem. So how does this happen? Well, sometimes it happens consciously and sometimes it happens unconsciously. Conscious things might be you're working in the domain, say, of music or poetry, and you find a hole or a gap that needs to be filled. Or you want to take two different theories from your field and try to combine them and see what happens then. Or you just want to do some experimenting, or just something may pop into your head that needs, that might be worth exploring. This can happen at the unconscious level too. You can be in your environment, walking through the park or doing something else, and something in the environment will trigger a creative problem for you. So you end up with a creative problem. Again, you may not consciously be aware of it, but the second stage is what we call incubation. And just like a chicken incubates and grows inside an egg, we can't see it growing in there, but it's growing. The same thing is happening with creative problems and creative ideas. When we aren't consciously thinking about them, they are still being worked in what I call the research and development parts of the brain. And that's the associational cortices. So they are basically pattern matching parts of the brain. And when they receive a request, whether it's conscious or unconscious, they start matching everything that is available to them. Again, whether it's coming in from the environment or whether it's already stored in your brain, for potential solutions. So it's trying to find a pattern match, and it's combining crazy things in order to do that. Now, depending upon the level of what I might say inhibition or the level of cognitive filters you have, these pattern matches will pop into conscious awareness, either fully formed or partially formed, and they may come gradually, they may not come as an aha moment, but they very well might come as an aha moment. And we call that the illumination stage, where answers for creative problems are becoming manifest, the illumination phase. So I'll give you an example from my own work of a person who was highly creative. This was a songwriter in one of my studies, somebody whose name you would likely recognize, but of course everybody in my studies remains anonymous, so I can't tell you her actual name. But when I asked her about how she wrote her music, she said, "Oh, I don't write the music. The angels write the music." And when I'm feeling particularly good and it's a particularly good night, always happens at night, an antenna pops out of my head and pulls in one of the angels' songs. And the angels let me arrange it however I want to do, but they won't let me change the melody or any of the lyrics. So she experiences these songs coming to her as fully formed and coming to her from outside of her. And I can't tell you how often this is reported by highly creative people. So that's the illumination phase. Then the next phase is evaluation. And notice I've got that in smaller letters because you have to be very, very careful of evaluating your creative ideas. when you have an idea, I suggest that before you even think about evaluating whether it is a decent idea or a foolish idea, that you write it down. I have an idea journal, and every time an idea pops into my head, I write it down. And then every couple of weeks, I go through that and I enter them into different files on my computer. But I never throw a creative idea away, because if it was a seed of a potential solution, maybe it just needs to be worked further, or maybe I need more information, but I don't want to throw that creative idea away. So I write it down. Then you can evaluate the idea. Is it going to serve my purposes right now to go further with this idea? Or do I need to discard it, not being appropriate for the moment? In which case, you've still got it in your idea journal, okay? So let's say I deem the idea that I had to be worthwhile. Then you need to elaborate it. That's the next stage. What does that mean? Flesh it out. So say you had an idea for the great American novel. Okay, you got the kind of rough skeleton of the plot that came to you. Now you have to flesh out the characters, you have to flesh out the environment, you have to, write the little subplots. All of that is part of elaboration. If you get an idea for a painting, you have the rough idea, but you've still got to flesh it out on canvas, etc. So that's elaboration. And then the final phase, which was not part of Graham Wallace's stages of creativity, is the implementation stage. And that is, okay, you wrote the great American novel, you painted this beautiful picture. Now, in order for it to be adaptive or useful in some way, you got to get it out there. That may just mean showing it to some of your close friends. It may mean getting a literary agent. It may mean finding a gallery that wants to show your work. Who knows what it means? It might mean getting your recipe into a cookbook. Whatever it is, you want to implement it and get it out there so that it can do good for other people. So this is the basic creative process, and some people divide it into two halves. The first half being creative idea generation, which includes preparation, incubation, and illumination. And the second part being the actual getting it out there implementation part, which is sometimes referred to in the business community as innovation. Okay, so far we've looked at the definition of creativity. We've looked at big C and little c creativity. So we need to know, is creative genius innate or is it acquired? And let's say it can be acquired or at least enhanced in some way. Can we enhance individual creativity? And just very briefly, I will touch on the fact that we know that there's a heritability component to creativity, and we're starting to figure out what some of the genetic contributions to that heritability are. So there's a lot of work being done on this. However, what we also know is that the genetic aspect of creativity can influence, but it does not cause creative genius. Each of us has the capacity for creativity. We each have our own unique repository of information, including knowledge, memories, experiences, and skills that no one else on this planet possesses. What we need to do is get better access at how our research and development brain is pattern matching So the next step, remember, you are creative, is to find out what are the components of creative genius and how can we train ourselves or learn to enhance them. And this is just going to take me to a quick description of what our course on creativity is about. We look at the research from 3 different levels of research. The first is reviewing existing empirical research, and we have a textbook that we use for that. It's not really a textbook, but it's a book with lots of information in it. The second thing is each person in the class chooses a creative luminary that they're interested in learning more about, and they read a biography, a good solid biography about that individual, and then they report back to the rest of the class in a series of short papers that are all published on our course website of the person's personality traits, their mental illness, if they had any, their early life, how that early life affected their creativity, and also the confluence of factors that they believe led to this person's ability to be a creative achiever. And then the final level of research is we use ourselves as subjects. All of us anonymously, so it's anonymous, nobody will know what your scores are, take measures of creativity, personality tests, all kinds of different things, so we can see how we as a class compare to the existing research. And we also look at multiple levels of analysis, the biological, psychological, social, environmental, and cultural levels. And those of you who've had classes from me know that I try to do this in all of my courses. So biologically, we already talked a little bit about genetics, but neuroscience. So what do we look at as far as neuroscience? Well, we look at a lot of things about neuroscience, but one of the interesting things that people always want to know about is the right hemisphere of the brain the creative part? And we see, this is a meme, right? We see it every place. Right side of the brain is creative, left side is analytic. Is this right or wrong? Well, what we find from the research, and this is just a very, very glancing look at it, is that people who score lower in creativity, when they're working on creative topics or doing creative work, do have more activation of the right hemisphere. But people who are highly creative have activation in both hemispheres almost equally. And one of the interesting things that we also found out was when we looked at Einstein's brain. I did not personally look at Einstein's brain. I don't mean to imply that, but fortunately, the doctor who removed his brain before he was buried took a number of pictures of his brain, and this is a section, a sagittal section of his brain. Pardon me. A cross section of his brain. And what we see right here, this is the corpus callosum, and it's the tract of neurons that connects the right brain to the left brain. And one of the big findings about Einstein's brain was his corpus callosum was gigantic. It was much bigger than we find in especially men of his age, at the age he was when he died, because we can't really compare his brain to a young brain. But even when we did compare it, researchers compared it to a young brain, they found that it was a great deal larger, which means his left brain and right brain were communicating with each other more perhaps than other people. So that's an interesting fact. Now I'm going to skip over the psychological, look at social and environmental. We want to look at how does the family, how does the upbringing, how does the early life contribute to creative achievement? How do mentors contribute? And how does being exposed early in life to creative domains affect your later creativity? And I can tell you it does affect it. So if you have young children or you have students, make sure that they're being exposed to good creative work at a young age. Culturally, we look at the openness of the culture. Some cultures are wide open to creativity. Others are very closed. For instance, if we want to think back to the Holy Roman Empire, it was relatively closed to new ideas at that point. We want to look at the wealth of the culture, because if people are struggling and spending all their waking hours trying to put food on the table, they're not going to have time for creative work. And then zeitgeist means the spirit of the day. Sometimes creativity is just in the air. And that's one of the things we look at. There's actual research on that. But going back to the psychological contributions, we've got personality traits, we've got cognitive components. Gender contributes, IQ, does that contribute? Well, there is a correlation between creativity and IQ up to about an IQ of 120. And then beyond that, IQ doesn't seem to make any difference. Talent, age, how does your age, your biological age, affect your ability to be creative? We look at motivation, we look at psychopathology, and that early life experience. So I'm just going to pull one of these things out right now, and that's cognition. And I want to show you different types of creative cognition. And then we're going to call it a night so that we can discuss and see what kind of questions you have. Divergent thinking is associated with creativity. And divergent thinking, as opposed to convergent thinking is using all of the contents of your memory to find the one right answer to a specific question. Whereas divergent thinking is generating multiple solutions to a particular problem or prompt. So being able to generate multiple different potential solutions. Metaphorical thinking, we know what that is, where you take information from one field and map it onto another. So one of the really interesting things that happened with this is when back in the early 20th century, scientists were trying to figure out what was the configuration of a single atom. They were able to use the metaphor of the solar system with the Earth and with the sun in the center and the planets circling around it as a metaphor for figuring out what an actual atom looked like. And they came up with the idea of the nucleus and the electrons surrounding it. Mental imagery is extremely important, being able to visualize things in your mind. So if you think about it, everything around you right now, from the computer that you're looking at, to the clothes you're wearing, to the jewelry you're wearing, to the building you're sitting in, all of these things were at once only an image in the brain of somebody just like you. Being able to take multiple perspectives, being able to improvise, using that imagination and imagining what if something was different in our world, how would that work? Paradoxical thinking, being able to see a thing and its opposite in the same cognitive space. And then cognitive disinhibition, which is loosening the filters on those things, on those mental mechanisms that keep ideas from coming into conscious awareness. I'll leave you with some references on the things I've been talking about. And at this point, I'd like to open it up for questions. So does anybody have questions about anything we've talked about? Yes, Maria.
I actually don't have a question. I just want to let you know that I thoroughly enjoyed this.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Maria. It's good to see you. Magna.
Good morning. I'm logging in from India. It's 5:30 a.m. right now.
Oh, thank you
Uh,
for tuning in. My goodness.
I was really looking forward towards this session. I've heard a lot about your classes, Dr. Carson, and I look forward towards attending one of them in the future. But other than that, I really enjoyed this session, and I wanted to let you know that I'm currently into music and mind, and I aspire to work as a holistic development counselor for students, and working with music therapy and art therapy. And currently I'm working with music therapy to understand how it impacts, how actually it helps to alleviate anxiety and stress in students. So this was really interesting because I just logged out of my music and mind class, and we had this music therapist who was delivering a talk, and then I attended your session. It was very insightful for me and very helpful. So thank you so much. And I would definitely go back to the recordings to check the resources that you mentioned, and the papers that you've mentioned would be really helpful to writing my paper. Thank you.
Very good. Well, I appreciate that. And I would just like to say a couple of things about music and music therapy. One of the things we find with music is it is one of those modalities that activates both sides of the brain, both hemispheres of the brain, and can actually help grow those connections in the corpus callosum. So that's one of the great things about it. And the second thing about it is obviously music, depending upon the tempo, depending on other aspects of the music, can elevate your mood. And so that's one of the reasons why it's so important in therapies. And the final thing is, as we know, it's very easy for us to remember music. It's easier to remember music than it is to remember facts. And so when we look at people that have Alzheimer's and dementia, very often they can go back and remember music. And when we expose them to music they remember, it helps their memory in other ways. So I'm very glad to know that Magna is working in music therapy. Marielle.
Yes. Hello, Dr. Carson. Happy to
Hello,
be here.
good to see you.
You too. I have here my notes at the beginning of the presentation. I heard something about the state of flow, and I wanted to know a little bit more about that. What is a state of flow, and how is it connected to the process of being creative? Is there a connection between
So,
that?
okay, so that's a great question. Almost universally, people who are involved in creative work report getting into a state of flow when they're doing their work creatively. And so the state of flow appears, this is work done by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi he was at the University of Chicago when he first started working on this. But basically flow is a state that you can get into when the challenge of the work you're doing is just about exactly equal to your perceived ability to handle that challenge. In other words, the skills and techniques you have to help you handle that challenge. And then what happens is basically we see that parts of the executive network turn down, the volume on those turn down, and you are just in this state where time seems to disappear, self-consciousness disappears, and it's just you and whatever it is you're doing, whether it's music or writing or painting or even being involved creatively in a sport. So it's definitely, and people don't report happy, happy, happy when they're in that state. But as soon as they come out of that state, they report that they were happy, that they were very eager to get back into that state. It's extremely rewarding. Csikszentmihalyi has a book called Creativity and one book called Flow. And so there's lots of information in both those books about that state. Kimia.
Hi, thank you so much, Dr. Carson, for this wonderful talk. I just wanted to ask you, because I'm really thinking about policies in education right now, and sometimes I feel like they clash with the ability to really cultivate creativity in students, especially in the younger ages, and for for example, for HES, whereas like global students, for older adults. But how do you help create policies that have that balance of not restricting your creativity and kind of allowing it to flourish and take advantage of it? Are there any, I know it's kind of a complicated question, but what do you recommend? How can we approach this so we can make a difference in policies to make things more, to make it more possible for us to use creativity at work when sometimes there's very strict boundaries?
Yeah, it's a really great question because everybody from teachers and school administrators and CEOs say they value creativity. In fact, they say it's one of the most important things that they value and that they want to instill in their students or in their employees. But guess what? When push comes to shove, they don't do it. And the reason they don't is because, number one, creativity is messy. There's a lot of trial and error. There's a lot of, I hesitate to call it failure, but anybody who's involved in a creative medium knows that failure is part of the creative process. You know, it works sometimes, it doesn't work sometimes. And I think our school systems and our businesses don't have time for those situations where we're experimenting and finding that that it's not working. The second thing is it's difficult to work with creative people. They don't always toe the line. Sometimes they're branded by teachers as troublemakers, even teachers that claim to value creativity. And so it's very difficult to work. But one of the things that I would suggest is that we try to incorporate more divergent thinking activities into the school curriculum and reduce the convergent activities. For instance, all of our exams are convergent. There's one right answer for each question, rather than asking some open-ended questions. How would you handle this situation? You know, or even giving students a project, and they have to go out on their own and do their research for it. Even young children can do this, even kids in 1st and 2nd grade. As long as they can read, they can go out there and they can research a project and then get together and brainstorm ways to put it together. And that kind of thing is very, very helpful in developing creativity. So my 2 recommendations are Sir Ken Robinson, whom I'm sure you're probably already familiar with, and Ron Beghetto, Beghetto. They are the 2 gurus on creativity in education. Scully.
Hello, Professor Carson. Thank you for joining us. I'm Scully. I work with Kimia and Laurie at Psychology Club. So this is my first time attending your lecture. It's wonderful and it's very insightful for me. So I have this question. As I noticed that you talked about the brand, a certain brand part of the instance brand that connects the left and the right parts of a brain, and that part is extraordinarily larger than the size of a normal human being, even at a younger age. I have this curiosity to see if there are other analysis or studies showing that there's maybe a direct alignment or correlation between human intelligence quotient and the size of that particular part of the brain bridge that connects the both parts of the brain, doesn't mean that if that indicates like a higher IQ, higher intelligence quotient of human beings. For the example, the Einstein, does it actually prove that the larger size is actually proportional? Large size of that the brain part is proportional to a higher IQ of a certain individual. Doesn't mean that for most mentally retarded, mentally challenged individuals, their certain part in their brain is actually either damaged or considerably smaller than a normal person. Is there any studies or researches that actually indicates the biological differences of this part?
So that's a great question. And I can tell you that it does seem to be associated with creativity, but less associated with what we would call IQ or intelligence. So there's other parts of the brain, especially prefrontal cortex, and especially the left prefrontal cortex in most people, that seems to be the areas that are involved in higher IQ. But of course, remember the whole concept of IQ is questioned today, and we have the idea of multiple intelligence.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Okay, sure. And Greg.
Oh, hi, Dr. Carson. I don't have a question, but I took your psychopathology class like a year or so ago, and it was great, and I recommend your classes to anyone.
Well, thank you so much, Greg. I appreciate that endorsement, and thank you for coming this evening or whatever time of day it is where you are. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. It's 8 p.m., but actually the sun darkened completely at 3. It was I'm in Cleveland, Ohio, and lucky enough to like be in the totality.
Yeah, how exciting, huh? A very exciting day.
Yeah, it was.
Thank you, Greg.
Oh, you're welcome, Dr. Carson.
Sumit?
Yeah, hi, Dr. Carson. First of all, thank you so much for such a wonderful talk. It was highly insightful and intriguing. I'm not a student of yours, unfortunately, but I did get an email regarding this talk, and I found it fascinating. My question is regarding the interplay, or I guess correlation between creativity and beauty, and how perhaps is there a human desire or need for, or even for creative people to ultimately go towards something being beautiful at the end. I guess the closest thing maybe is perhaps from disorder to order, and you could argue that that's going from something that's perhaps not so uniform to something that is more uniform and simplistic. But I just wanted to get maybe your thoughts on this.
Yes, so I think that's a really great question. In the original, remember how I told you that there were two components that scientists had agreed on in the definition of creativity, and that was originality or novelty and adaptiveness or utility. In the original, Frank Barron was the one, he was a researcher out of Berkeley back in the 1960s, and he's credited with being the first one to really talk about those two elements. But he added a third element, and that is that it has to be aesthetically pleasing. Now, what does aesthetically pleasing mean in order to be creative? In Frank Barron's parlance, that meant that it just had to feel right. It had to have this something about it that just, I guess feeling right or feeling beautiful would be the way that you would explain it. Now, since Frank Barron, other researchers have dropped that aspect of it because we look at creativity in so many different areas. And we look at creativity, for instance, in military strategy. That can be very creative. but maybe people don't think of it as being beautiful. I mean, ways to wage war may not be considered beautiful by a lot of people. So that's why that kind of got dropped by the wayside. But there's this whole new area of inquiry called neuroaesthetics that's looking at the human need for beauty. And so I would say your question is very, very relevant and very timely. Okay, Bill. And by the way, Kimia, what do you think? Can we just stay till all our questions are answered and let people drop off that need to drop off?
Thank you so much. I was just going to ask you if you're okay staying. We are more than happy to stay if you're okay with it.
Yeah. Why don't we
Perfect.
stay and answer people's questions, and then when we're done, we can all we can just sign off. That sounds good to me.
Perfect. Thank you.
Bill.
Hello, Dr. Carson. I actually took your psychopathology class. I think the first time you ever taught Zoom in 2020, in your first Zoom session ever. My question is sense of humor? Have you studied how sense of humor is associated with creativity or even mental illness?
So both of those things. The first thing I want to say is I developed a measure, my colleagues and myself developed a measure called the Creative Achievement Questionnaire. And it measures creative achievement in 10 different domains of the arts and sciences. And one of those is humor. So humor is definitely falls under the umbrella of creative work. I've also done some research on it, some published research on it with a couple of students that are working on it. And one of my students, John Ball, and I are in the process of publishing a paper looking at comedians and mental illness. So he put out a survey he's a comedian, a stand-up comedian, and he put out a survey to about 400 comedians in all different areas. There's professional comedians, there were amateur comedians, there were student comedians, and the rates of certain types of mental illness, especially depression and bipolar, were higher in this group than they are in the general population. But humor, you got to look at humor as a way of perhaps autotherapy, self-therapy in some way. That's the way I look at it. Thank you for the question, Bill. And thank you for
very much.
being a student. Hey, Allison.
Dr. Carson, hello. Thank you so much for doing this. It was wonderful as usual.
No, thank you.
Quick question. So I'm quite familiar with creative interventions for certain patient populations, like persons with dementia or certain types of mental illness like depression, using things like music and dance. And the effect on the brain is profound. What I'm wondering is I shouldn't say more, but in certain delicate populations, such as schizophrenia, that have hallucinations and delusions as part of the pathology, have you found that it needs to be a more controlled or delicate approach to a creative intervention so that it doesn't exacerbate any kind of hallucinations or delusions?
So what we've found in general is the type of therapy that is most often used with people with schizophrenia is art therapy. And this started with Hans Prinzhorn way back in, I can't remember, the 1920s, when he ran a psychiatry ward in Europe and began noticing that his people with psychosis were doing a lot of painting and drawing, and some of that work was really profoundly creative. And so that has become a therapy of a go-to therapy in wards with psychosis. Does it exacerbate hallucinations and delusions? it more often looks like it's expressive work that is expressing what the person might be actually experiencing. And so everything I know about art therapy and schizophrenia is that therapists consider it to be quite beneficial. But I don't know that much about dance therapy and schizophrenia. I have to say that.
I ask partially because I know there are certain types of music in depressive patients that will exacerbate the depression and others that will uplift their mood. And so it seems in studies they've had to tailor it to some degree, but that makes sense. Thank you so much.
And the other thing that I would say is that it's very common to do a playlist. The idea is meet the person where they are mood-wise. So if a person's depressed, you start out with some relatively depressing music, and we have a whole list of depressive music. And then you gradually lighten it, but you have to do it very, very gradually across maybe a playlist of 30 minutes until you get to the more uplifting music, and then you leave them with the uplifting aspects of the music. But if you don't meet them where they are, if you start playing uplifting music for people who are depressed, they'll leave it. They won't listen to it because it's not congruent with their current mood.
So interesting. Thank you so much, Dr. Carson.
Sure. Lori.
Yes, I wanted to convey a question that came through the chat a little while ago from Tamra, who asked if we had time for only one book, which one would you recommend?
Well, that's a little difficult because I wrote a book on creativity, so I would like to recommend that. That's called Your Creative Brain. If you only had one book, boy, I've got so many favorites, so many favorites. It depends on whether you want a book that is going to describe how to be more creative, or you want to just learn about creativity in general. I would say that. So which would you like?
I guess, Tamara, that's a question for you, maybe?
Is she still here?
Yes, but I'm not sure if they're okay to come unmute themselves.
Okay. All right. So I would just say that The Artist's Way is one of my very favorite books. I love that book. If you wanted just information about creativity, then I recommend the Cambridge Handbook of Creativity. It's dense and it's an edited book with a lot of different chapters in it, written by different experts in different aspects of the field. But it's like if you read everything that was in that book, you would know more about creativity than most people who teach courses in creativity. And then my book's called Your Creative Brain. Scully.
Hi, Professor Carson. Excuse for my curiosity. This lecture is very interesting to me. I do have a follow-up question. I wanted to know, since you mentioned that the part in Einstein's brain doesn't directly indicate to the high intelligence or quality of IQ, I'm actually wondering, is it possible that a person with high creativity but can still be suffering from low IQ from a traditional perspective? Because as what we can see in the modern society, people who are particularly good in mathematics, in calculation, in algebra, and all the math-related subjects are considered better and with more IQ, higher IQ compared to people, compared to West population. So I do know that some people who are good in math are also great artists. And they are also enjoying from their life with abandoned creativity in all forms of arts and music and all the other artificial manifestations. So I'm actually, but on the flip side, I also wanted to know that if it's possible that people who are considered with low IQ, a lower, maybe comparatively lower IQ, but still manifest as a highly adaptable creativity in the society in other forms of like arts or music or something like that. So how can we quantify the correlations between the two parts, the traditional IQ part and the modern creativity part by the definition?
Okay, so first of all, let me say this, that I talked to you a little bit a minute ago about the connection or the association between creativity and IQ. And what the research shows, measuring creativity through divergent thinking tests, that the correlation between creativity and IQ is about 0.33, but only up to an IQ of 120.
Okay.
So the suggestion then is that there might be a threshold above which creative IQ is necessary but not sufficient to be creative. Now, the interesting thing is that threshold is dependent upon the domain in which the person is working. So if we were working in theoretical physics, then we might think that the IQ above 120 would be beneficial. However, my own work, and I've done some work on this, shows that you need a lower threshold for creativity in music and even lower than that in the visual arts.
Thank you so much. This is very informative. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would also like to say that there is a class of individuals, in particular artistic savants,
Yes,
who
exactly.
actually are highly creative but have very low measured IQs. And there's one person I was thinking of in particular named Alonso Clements, and he was a sculptor. And I want you to think about how creative this is. He had an IQ so low that he couldn't care for himself, and he had to live in an institution. All he wanted to do was make sculptures, animal sculptures, out of clay. And he made beautiful small sculptures out of clay. Well, can you just mute yourself, Scully, because we're hearing a lot of background noise.
Sorry about that.
There, that's great, thank you. And then when you want to talk, you can unmute again. But anyway, so Alonso, one of his therapists decided he was spending too much time doing these sculptures and not enough time trying to work on self-improvement, like being able to dress himself or feed himself or whatever. So they took his clay away from him. Well, then he went missing. And what they found was that he had got himself out of his window onto the roof of the institution where he was living, and he was pulling the tar out from underneath the shingles so that he could use that tar as a substitute for clay. Now, regardless of how creative you think his sculptures are, the idea that he was able to find this alternate use for tar is highly, highly creative, even though he had such a low IQ. So remember always, when we have findings in psychology and other fields of science, we're looking at generalities. So in general, as IQ goes up, creativity goes up to a particular threshold, but that doesn't mean there aren't exceptions to that rule and some highly creative people with lower IQs.
Thank you so much, Professor Carson. Sorry for the unmute thing. I was so immersed into your conversation, totally forgot my surroundings. I'm in the science center. Sorry about that.
Wonderful. Okay, any other questions? Kimia, did you see any questions in the chat that we didn't get to?
No, thankfully. Thank you so much for staying longer. I know we took so much of your time, but I think those were, I mean, I'm sure we can ask you questions forever because you have so much knowledge, but for now, yeah.
My email is on any of my syllabi, and people please feel free to email me with any other questions you might have. And other than that, I hope to see some of you in future classes.
I have one more question. Somebody asked if it's possible to share your slides, and Meghna was the one who asked, since she's working on her paper, is it possible to share your slide, or can she email you? What's the best way?
Why doesn't she email me? I think that might be a good idea.
Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you again for this opportunity. It was great seeing all of you. And I'll look forward to seeing you in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Carson.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carson.
Certainly.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so
Bye.
much, Professor
Thank you.
Carson. Bye. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye. Dr. Carson, would you like us to stay longer? Is there anything that you would like to talk to us about?
I don't think so, unless I'm interested in the psychology club. If you can send me some information on that, I'd be very happy to see it because I wasn't aware of it. Of course, I know, but I would like to know more about the psychology club.
Absolutely. And I've been tagging you on the LinkedIn stuff because we shared it. I don't know if you're active on LinkedIn, but I would absolutely, it's my pleasure.
Okay, thank you.
Dr.
Thank
Carson,
you
I
so
just want to
much.
say hi because I'm from Tampa and our fathers used to work together at Tampa International Airport, if you remember that.
Oh my gosh. Yes, Bill.
So I just wanted to say hi.
So thank you so much for coming tonight.
Are you in Naples?
I'm in Naples.
Okay, good. Well, I'm in Tampa, so hi. Thank you very
Hi,
much.
just down
This
the
was
street.
great.
Oh,
And my
thank
wife
you.
got to hear you. I'm so happy she got to hear you speak.
Oh, good. Oh, great. Well, thank you. Thank you all. And yes, Tampa. I spent a lot of my youth there.
Thank you all so much for being here tonight.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, Professor Carson. Good night, everyone. Kimia and Laurie. Everyone, yes. Bye.
Everyone's done. I think I'm gonna go ahead and hang up now.
Thank you guys for being here.
Have a good night.
Good night.